Since its inception 22 years ago, the NFC South has had a wildcard qualifier just 8 times. And if you don't win this division, you probably suck. And yet, these 4 teams have all made the Super Bowl, winning 3 between them. Things have fallen away in the last 2 years, with 4 new head coaches and only 1 winning record. The 2023 Bucks going just 9-8. Yet this team is flush with fantasy league winning talent. So let's dive deep into the NFC South on the Fantasy First Down. Hello and welcome to the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. If you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube. You can also check us out on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down, on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no-o, and our website is ffdfantasyfootball.com, where I've got all my dynasty and rookie rankings, plus all the articles I wrote over on Razzball as well. Today we're talking about the NFC South in our 7th of 8 fantasy deep dives. After this, I'll be breaking down everything we learned from the OTAs and updating my dynasty rankings. So make sure you look out for those later on in the week. So the NFC South's been pretty weak the last couple of years, but that doesn't stop it from having a heap of fantasy studs. So let's get into the top guys and find out what we're going to learn with the Atlanta Falcons.
Says 4-year deal for Kirk Cousins. The Atlanta Falcons. He is leaving Minnesota.
Kirk's great drop. He fades. Man wide open. Caught. Touchdown! The Atlanta Falcons select Michael Penix Jr.
Well, there it is.
Quarterback, Washington.
That is the first surprise of the NFL draft.
What do you think that makes me feel like?
Just about got to zero. Penix gets the snap off. Takes the shot. But Bernard is talented, so he's stepping in now toward the end zone. Caught! What a throw! Polk! Touchdown!
They're shutting down for the Falcons on the toss. It's Robinson. Couple of nice moves. Out across the 45. It's still going.
And he does the football. Puts a move on. Brings on Robinson. He's got a little bit of pressure. Ritter floats it for London, who separates for the catch. They try reverse here. Drake London's going to throw it. Going deep. And the catch is made by Kyle Pitts. 2nd and 4. Ritter pulls it out of the end zone for Pitts. Touchdown. Fields loads up going end zone. That's Mooney. He's got it. Murray takes the low snap. Dumps it off to Rondale Moore. Dancing up the far side of the field.
Well, you can't argue with the Atlanta Falcons' consistency. Since that Super Bowl run, they've made 7-win seasons their thing. 5 out of their last 6 seasons, they've had 7 wins. And that's not what you're looking for if you're looking for another Super Bowl. So they're going to need to change things around. They've done just that, bringing back Raheem Morris, who's been over at the Rams as their DC the last 3 years. He brings in a fellow Rams alum, Zach Robinson, as his new OC. This is his first time as a legit OC. He's been the QB coach over with the Rams. It'll be interesting to see what he brings. We don't exactly know what to expect, but we think he's probably going to model it roughly on the Rams system. The Rams use a lot of 11 personnel, which is interesting because the Falcons didn't last season. With Arthur Smith, they used the least 11 personnel across the league. So I'd expect a lot more of Darnell Mooney and Rondale Moore, and perhaps they'll also bring in a lot more of Hodge and McLeod as well. Regardless, you can expect to see a whole lot less 2 tight end sets and better usage of Kyle Pitts. I'd expect a more balanced run-pass attack after they were really run-heavy with way too much Tyler Algier last season. You'd also expect a lot more receivers touching the ball, which has got to help Drake London as well. I'd also expect the run attack to be a little bit better balanced. They were a little bit too much outside zone last time. I'd expect more inside attacks, and I'd expect to see a featured tight end because that's what always has happened with Raheem Morris as head coach. So let's have a look at where they're spending their money. Well, they've given Kirk Cousins a big contract. Then they drafted a rookie quarterback, which is a really just frankly bad use of funds. They've got very little cap space, and yet they're paying a whole heap of money for a guy who's going to be redundant in a year or two. That's not how you win Super Bowls. That's why this is a constant 7-win team rather than actually going for titles and doing proper rebuilds in between. You can see the players they've brought in. They've brought in both Cousins and Penix and then brought in no real talent elsewhere. They're giving little money to Mooney and Moore, who aren't true number 2 and number 3 wide receivers. The players they've lost aren't anything special, but they've not brought in enough talent to actually make a title run. I think this is a real mistake, and they're going to end up being average again this year. Having said that, I do expect that Kirk Cousins will be the main guy. And Kirk Cousins does tend to be very good for fantasy. He's a very aggressive quarterback. I nearly said efficient. That's not true. He's definitely a very aggressive quarterback, and he's had a long run of consistent top fantasy finishes. And he usually stays healthy, and last season was very much unlike him. It's unusual for him to sit out a long run of games. So I'd expect that he'll probably be back, staying healthy and being aggressive next season with the Falcons as well. He definitely dropped in accuracy last season, particularly in his deep ball, and that's a bit of a concern, but I would expect him to mostly be working in the medium to short areas anyway with this lineup. How Michael Penix is involved, we don't really know. If they start to lose a whole heap of games, it wouldn't surprise me at all, is it if they let Cousins go and then bring in Michael Penix. There are also a couple of other theories. I know Walt from World of Football, when I was on their show, was talking about how potentially they looked at Kirk Cousins, went, oh, this guy's actually not healthy, or this guy's actually not looking very good. We actually need to go out and draft someone. And they just plan on considering Kirk Cousins as a sunk cost. That's kind of smart in that you're willing to acknowledge you've made a mistake and then go and do a proper rebuild. I don't think it's what any owners of either Kirk Cousins or Michael Penix particularly want to hear. I think most people would understand that if they can get Penix to actually learn behind Cousins for a little while, that's probably going to make him a better player long term, and is also going to help Cousins out as well, because we're going to get a bit of value from him in the short term. Regardless, assuming that Cousins is the QB, I think that's going to help this whole attack function a whole lot better, especially with the new play calling as well. Now, their running attack was average last year, and Bijan Robinson was the worst top 10 drafted running back in his rookie season as far back as I could find, certainly within the last 20 years. Top 10 drafted running backs are always successful. They always have top 10 fantasy finishes in their rookie season, assuming they stay healthy. And Robinson didn't. He had plenty of touches. He had well and truly enough touches. If you're getting your hands on the ball 270 times, you should be finishing higher than a top 12 fantasy finish. He just wasn't able to be as effective as he can be because they were using the backups too much. They weren't getting the offense to run as it should. He should be having a bounce back season this year. He's my number one running back in Dynasty. No one is as talented and young as Bijan Robinson. I know a lot of people like Breece Hall. I know a lot of people like Jahmyr Gibbs, and those guys are good. But Robinson in this offense should be a whole lot more effective. He's someone I really like for Dynasty. Now, to be fair, you either have Robinson or you don't have him. If you're in a Dynasty startup, he's someone you can go and get early, but realistically, there's better value in drafting wide receivers. So I can't really recommend you go out and get Bijan Robinson. Most of the time, someone's going to overpay for him because you're going to always overpay for running backs if you're taking him early in startups, and no one's going to trade him away. So you've got to hope that he has a bit of a slow start to this year, and then you can certainly buy low on him. I also think this is the kind of time where you should probably still be hanging on to Tyler Algier. I feel like he's the kind of guy who's going to be a really valuable handcuff, and we've seen how useful he can be when the starter goes down because he is a good running back. He's just nowhere near as good as Bijan. So I expect he's more of a true backup this year, but I do think he is the handcuff to own. I'm not particularly interested in Chase McClellan. I feel like he's probably more of a special teams guy, and it wouldn't surprise me if they bring in a passing guy, probably also Avery Williams, who did that job a couple of years ago and looked pretty good doing it. Although it is a new coaching staff, so you just never know. The wide receiver room is weak. It's kind of Drake London and then nobody else. You've got to expect that Bijan and Kyle Pitts are probably going to be getting a lot of receptions. But as I said earlier, we're expecting a lot of 11 personnel, which means some of these guys are needing to be out on the field. I expect Drake London is going to be the featured guy. He's my wide receiver 18 overall, despite the fact that he's never had a top 30 season. So it's a little bit concerning for any Drake London owners. And yet, I'm very bullish on him because I do believe with Kirk Cousins or Michael Penix, he's going to be a good wide receiver. I do believe they're going to finally start using him properly. Plenty of players in the past have had year 3 breakouts. I know we've been spoiled, by having wide receivers being good very early on in their careers. That's not normal. It's significantly more normal to build into a career, and I expect that London's going to do that and be particularly good this year. He's someone I'm going out of my way to get if someone is willing to sell him pretty cheap. Now, I'm not particularly interested in any of these backups. I know that Darnell Mooney and Rondale Moore are nominally the wide receiver 2 and 3. They're both kind of slot receivers. I feel like they're going to need someone who can function on the outside and also be a slightly better blocking running back. I feel like that's where Kadarrell Hodge comes in. I feel like he probably takes on that role, and we also get Ray McLeod in there for some gadget snaps as well. So I feel like Mooney and Moore are going to be more like 50 to 70% snap guys, but I've also left the possibility open for the fact that one of them might get shifted outside, probably Mooney, and then he's able to function as an every down wide receiver and have a little bit more value this way. Regardless, I'm not overly interested in either of those guys. I just don't see the clear path to value when there's 3 significantly more talented players on the field. One of those more talented players is Kyle Pitts, who's still my tight end 4. We've seen what he can do when given the touches. Arthur Smith's totally messed around with using him, did not use him effectively at all. There was too much Jonnu Smith. And don't get me wrong, Jonnu Smith's a fine player. It's just that Kyle Pitts is one of the best tight ends we've seen in the last couple of decades. I know we've been spoiled the last couple of years with good receiving tight ends, but Kyle Pitts is different. He was the top 10 draft pick for a reason. He has a top 5 finish under his arm. What does he have it under? He's got to have it under something. Write in the comments what he should have it under. Kyle Pitts has a top 5 finish under something. He can do that again. There's no reason he can't. We can see when he's given the ball, he can be really effective. They're just not using him properly. So I expect him to be out there a whole lot more, with Warner and Dwelly probably, with a little bit of John Fitzpatrick, basically just doing that blocking role, being the backup receiving guys. I think it's going to be Pitts and absolutely nothing else behind him for the Falcons this year. Now, speaking of teams that have struggled the last few years, it was last year's worst team, arguably, the Carolina Panthers.
The Carolina Panthers select Xavier Liggett,
Jonathan Brooks,
Jatavian Sanders, tight end, Texas. Keep pounding.
On first down, end zone, touchdown, DJ Chark.
Trying to run for it again. Oh, he makes the man whiff.
Throwing this side of the field, the catch is made by Deontay Johnson, and Johnson shaking tacklers. What a job by Deontay Johnson.
Surprised, but blessed at the same time.
Stepping in for the injured Bryce Young. Dalton to the end zone. Adam Thielen. Touchdown.
First interception of the season. Brooks! Goodbye! Need to pick early.
Now Brooks makes the cut. It's space. Brooks accelerates. Texas touchdown.
Ian Sanders the likeliest to win it this year. There's Jonathan Brooks. He may go. Throws. Jump ball. What a catch. Xavier Liggett. High hit. Rattler. Single coverage for Liggett.
Now off the back foot. Throws it up one-on-one. Liggett.
Downfield. Caught. Still perfect. And Liggett will win another foot race. Rattler stands tall and he completes for a first down. Oh my goodness. The Jets are on for Xavier Liggett. Turned a first down into a touchdown. Specifically Sawyer Robertson. Ewers downfield. What a grab. One hand. Jatavian Sanders is loose. Stiff arming at the 25. And
So after a string of successful performances in the 2010s, including a Super Bowl run in 2015, the Carolina Panthers have really gone downhill. They haven't had a winning season since 2017, and they've had 4 different head coaches in the last 2 seasons. Things are pretty ugly there, and they have another head coach now. It's Dave Canales. And I'm not really convinced by this hire. I'm not really sure what they're aiming for, but I do know what we should expect. Probably going to look a little bit like the Bucs, given that both Canales and Idzik have been at the Bucs the last couple of seasons. What does that look like? Well, it's kind of hard to know. The Bucs were pretty neutral in passing rate, and they were pretty slow in play rate, and I expect that to continue, and that's not generally particularly good for fantasy. Not that the Panthers have been good for fantasy previously. Last season, they had the second least points for. They were pass heavy, but not successful in actually getting the ball over the line. They generally feature a running back in Bucs attacks that Canales has been charge of. So I expect they'll do the same thing, a running back, 2 wide receivers, tight ends. I mean, realistically, that's kind of what the Panthers have got. That's where their talent lies. I'd expect a lot of 11 personnel with a little bit of 12 personnel. They do use a lot of 1x3 groupings, which is really interesting. Basically, that's 3 wide receivers on the strong side and 1 tight end on the other side. I expect we'll see a fair amount of that as well. That could suit them and could help them out because they were very effective with it at the Bucks previously. So I'd expect that to carry over to the Panthers. The Panthers have very little cap space, a whole lot of dead cap space. They've franchise tag Burns and then traded him away. They're spending their money on random linemen and aging veterans. I just don't really understand what they're quite doing. They need to do a proper rebuild, and they haven't really quite committed to that. They spent a whole lot to go and get Bryce Young. Then they were terrible, missed out on having a first-round pick that they could have spent on a significantly better quarterback. I feel like that mistake's going to set them back a long way. Having said that, if you look at their key fantasy additions, there's some good names there. Jonathan Brooks is going to be a really good running back, the best running back in this class. Xavier Legette is a guy that I personally really like. They brought in Deontay Johnson, who's very underrated. They've got arguably the second best tight end in the class in Jatavian Sanders. I think they got a real bargain in bringing in him cheaply. And if you look at the guys that they've lost, I mean, DJ Chark, is that a big loss? None of these other guys are even real fantasy relevant starters. Hayden Hurst, maybe. I mean, there's nobody there that's particularly exciting. So at least there's a chance that they're solid this year, but I still think they're certainly going to miss the playoffs. The question is, what can they do for fantasy? Well, it's all going to revolve around Bryce Young, who was pretty mediocre last year. Those PFF grades are bad. He was bad in all areas of the field. They kept him passing it pretty short, and he still wasn't effective there. He wasn't particularly effective at scrambling either. He just didn't offer anything in particular. 11 touchdowns and 10 intercepts is not what you expect to see from a starter. I'm hoping that Canales comes in and he's more effective in using their short rookie quarterback. That's something they've talked about previously. Obviously, now that Young's in his second year, they need to find ways of utilizing his skill set without disadvantaging him based on the weaknesses around his size and his inability to particularly throw accurately over the last couple of years. I would still expect that they stick with him throughout this season. I don't think they're suddenly going to go across to Andy Dalton, for example. The run game should be the real focus. It has been for some time for the Panthers, and it was for the Bucks last season with Rashad White having that top 5 fantasy finish. I would expect that normally Jonathan Brooks would look really good this year, but I'm very nervous that there have been a lot of reports saying that he's not likely to be ready anytime soon with his injury and that they're pushing his timeline back. It's an ACL tear. We know that they tend to take time to recover, and players coming off ACL tears are often pretty bad, especially if they're running back in their first season back. So it might be a season or two before we see the best out of Jonathan Brooks. Having said that, that's probably true of this whole offense as a whole. If I'm grabbing in for Dynasty, I'm definitely not hoping that I'm trying to win now. I'm thinking a couple of years down the track when he could finally be productive for you. I do still think he's going to get a heavy workload this year once he's actually healthy. I'm not willing to transfer across to Chuba Hubbard just yet. I'm certainly not interested in Miles Sanders. It is Brooks for me. And I think Hubbard is probably the handcuff. If you're in a situation where you really do care about winning those first couple of weeks and you're weak at running back, Hubbard's someone that you can pick up, because it wouldn't surprise me if he's the starter out the gate as Brooks starts to get acclimatized, especially if he doesn't have much of a preseason. We don't know exactly how that's going to look, and we'll hear more closer to the time. But at this stage in the preseason, Hubbard's at least a good player to have somewhere on your bench, especially if you already own Brooks. But even if you don't, and you're looking for someone who can use in a pinch, Hubbard is a valuable option there. Miles Sanders is getting a big contract. I don't think that means they're suddenly going to start using him. But with a new coaching staff in, you just never know. That puts this in a little bit of flux. But I think the fact that they went out and got Brooks tells you everything you need to know about both Hubbard and Sanders' chances of being productive in the long term, at least. The wide receiver room has also had a heap of changes. Obviously not happy with the fact that most of their production was coming from a 32-year-old wide receiver in Adam Thielen, and he's not getting any younger. He's someone who I think will probably still be a starter for them, at least to start the season, but he did start to drop off towards the end of last year, as I think they realized that there's really no point in investing so heavily in a play that's going to be gone before they're actually good. They brought in Xavier Legette. I love this guy. I think he's so entertaining to watch. He's so strong. He looks really big, but he's actually only 6'1", which to be fair is still pretty tall, but not for a big-bodied wide receiver. He's just so good in traffic, so good at pulling in contested catches, very good after the catch as well, have solid speed. To me, most years he's going to get into the first round easily. In this case, he scraped in as the 32nd pick. I think he is a legit first round prospect. It's just a really strong wide receiver class, so he dropped a little bit more. I feel like he would normally go in that Quentin Johnston range, and he has the same risk. There are going to be separation issues. He has pretty good hands, but that certainly could be something that comes up as well. I'm not convinced he's going to be the wide receiver one out the gate, but I certainly think he's going to be better than Jonathan Mingo, who's starting to trend towards being a little bit of a bust. I wouldn't personally totally give up on Mingo because I do think Thielen starts to drift out of contention after some stage. They don't really have a clear slot guy, though, so it's probably going to be Thielen initially, but I think they probably just cycled these guys through the slot. Might even start using Johnson there a lot more as he used to be used at some stage in the past. Johnson could be productive if he's healthy. We've seen him have some really good seasons. He's more of a volume receiver and very good in PPR. I think he's probably got a good couple of years left in him. So I think it's probably going to be Johnson and Leggett leading this attack. It's just a question of whether they're pass heavy enough to really make these guys good for fantasy. The tight ends here don't, in general, particularly interest me. We haven't seen them be particularly good for Carolina, but we have seen the Bucs at least try to use Cade Otton at times. Will they do the same thing with one of these guys? For me personally, I favor Sanders out of these three guys. Ian Thomas is very much the blocking back. You're not getting anything out of him. Tommy Tremble wasn't day 2 pick a couple of years ago, but he's been pretty disappointing. He didn't look particularly good when given the opportunity. I personally think that he's a backup. They've brought in Sanders for a reason. It's just a question of whether they're actually willing to feature one of these guys or whether it's a little bit of a committee where Thomas does a lot of the early down work, Tremble comes in a little bit, and Sanders is the main receiving back, but isn't actually out there on non-clear passing plays. Sanders was my number 2 tight end rookie, but I started to drop him down a little bit. I'm just not really happy with what I'm hearing and seeing from out of the Panthers camp, and I'm feeling a little bit better about Ben Sinnott by comparison, and also Cade Otton. So I've moved both of those guys off. Sanders moves down a little bit for me. He's the tight end 20 because he does have a lot of upside. He's also very young. He only really played a couple of years at college, so there's certainly growth potential. He's playing with a very good team and being effective as well. So it wouldn't surprise me if after a season or two, he suddenly breaks out. So especially on a deeper league, he's someone you can hold on to, especially if you have a taxi spot. I think he's going to be really useful of that as well. Now, let's move on to my favorite team in this division, the New Orleans Saints.
There's rush 5. Carr steps up and delivers downfield. Get a 50-50 ball. What a catch by Olave. With the boundary. Carr pump fakes. Launches. Touchdown. Second launch on first. Carr floats. Another open target. That's Shaheed.
Lets it fly. He's got 18 Perry.
In the backfield with Taysom Hill and Jamal Williams. While Saunders ran around, Hill finds a wide open Johnson.
Very predictable, but very hard to stop tonight. Taysom Hill breaking free.
Carr down the sideline, open, makes the catch. Taysom Hill
looking downfield. He's got a nice toss to Johnson.
And Olave as Kamara shakes off an ankle tackle. He's got
short. It's the O-line. Jamal Williams, couple blockers in front.
Defensive back.
Hill took the handoff. Carr was split out wide to the right.
For whatever reason, I think most people have a pretty negative perception of the Saints. They were bad for a long time, and I think that probably colors it that way. But we've also seen that they've kind of struggled to have any real talent over the last few years, but they still keep on winning. They haven't had less than 7 wins in a year since 2005. And they've had, 6 out of the last 7 seasons be winning seasons, making the playoffs in 4 of those. I mean, they've been consistently pretty good. Even when Sean Payton left, they didn't really rebuild. Instead, they kind of just tried to keep on winning. And I feel like they are kind of on the cusp of being able to make it at least into the playoffs again, because they've still got enough talent, particularly on the defensive side. If you look at their rankings from last season, top 10 in points for, top 10 in least points against, really good turnover ratio, tend to be pretty pass neutral, run a lot of plays per game. All of those things are both good for actual production and good for fantasy as well. So it could be that we see another productive year for the Saints. They do have a lot of dead cap space because they tend to do that thing where they put people on contracts and roll the costs into later years, and that seems to really work. They also don't have a lot of cap space because of that, but I think they could still be effective this year, even though they haven't brought in much talent. If you look at their key additions, they're not really big names that are getting you excited. There are a couple of like low-end wide receivers where they struggled last year. They need to replace Michael Thomas, and a couple of backup quarterbacks because Jameis Winston wasn't really worth paying that money to. A lot of people are excited about Spencer Rattler. I'm not so much, and I'll tell you why in a sec. Let's talk about the play calling for a second. I'm not sure exactly what to expect from Clint Kubiak. There's a lot of talk that he's going to bring in a lot of different 49ers elements to this offense because that's what he has, where he has been previously. I think it's probably going to look less like the last time we saw him as an OC when he was with the Vikings back in 2021. And I think he briefly called plays with the Broncos in 2022 as well. He tends to lean a little bit pass heavy, but he's spoken a lot about wanting to be more run heavy and establish the run. And I think if you look at this team, you look at where the talent lies, it's not with the quarterback and the pass catchers. They've got 3 legitimately solid running backs and a good O-line. So it does make sense that you want to be a little bit more pass heavy. Chris Olave has described him as being pretty aggressive and going for a lot of explosive plays, and that can be pretty good for fantasy. But we've seen in the past that has meant slightly inconsistent play calling, and it's hard to know exactly what to expect from drive to drive and game to game. So I think Kubiak's going to be interesting. I think he's probably going to help the run game more than the pass game, if anything, because I think even though it's against his natural tendencies, he is probably going to want to run hard and also check down to the running backs a lot as well. Derek Carr cops a lot of flack, but he is pretty jolly consistent. He's been a top 20 fantasy quarterback for as long as I can remember, and probably as long as he's been around. I expect the same thing continues here because he just stays healthy and manages to stay on the field and just run a functional attack. He's not amazing. He's just solid. He's particularly good in those short to medium areas, and I expect they'll use that a lot again, even though I'm sure they're going to go for some big plays. He was solid again last year, but he was taken off the field plenty for Taysom Hill, and I think the same thing probably happens here. I think a lot of people thought that bringing Spencer Rattler in was as a possible Derek Carr replacement. I'm not so sure about that. He's still locked up for a few years, Carr, and I don't think Rattler's really that big a talent. He was a 5th-round pick, and the success rate of those guys is extraordinarily low. I know we talk about guys like Brock Purdy, but realistically, can you think of anyone else in the last 3 rounds who's been a successful quarterback? I mean, Gardner Minshew, maybe. Kirk Cousins and Dak Prescott were 4th-round guys, at least they're day 3. I mean, there's not exactly a long list of names, so the chances of Rattler being even relevant to this team is very low. I think it's still going to be Derek Carr for at least a couple of years to come until they do an actual rebuild. Then they bring in a new quarterback who's going to start for them. Now, this is a good running back room. Alvin Kamara's kind of lost a bit of a step over the last few years, but he's still been effective despite battling some injuries. He gets a lot of checkdowns, and that was really where his value came from last year. If you watch football or even followed fantasy, you wouldn't have thought of him as being a top 10 fantasy running back last year, despite missing 4 games. That's overall, not even on a per-game basis. I don't think the same thing's going to happen this year. I would still expect plenty of checkdowns, but I think at some point they've got to start getting Kendre Miller involved. The other thing to take an interest in as well is that Kamara is staying away from the team for contract reasons. That's a little bit weird because they owe him $18 million this year, but I feel like his main concern is that there aren't a lot of guarantees in that, and if he gets injured at training camp, then he's not going to get any of that money. They probably just cut him. So I feel like he's trying to at least get a lower salary with more guarantees. If that's the case, that makes a little bit more sense. But I don't think the Saints can really afford to do that. They don't have enough dead cap space. I think it's better off just holding him to his contract, using him for another season or 2, and then moving on. I think that's going to make more sense to them. So we'll see what they end up doing with Kamara, but there is a little bit of risk because of that, and I've dropped him down ever so slightly. I haven't really given Kendre Miller a clear boost. He wasn't used a lot last year at all, even when there were injuries to Kamara and Williams. It was very inconsistent how they used these 3 backs. Miller doesn't particularly excite me. He's a solid back. He's talented, but when given the ball last year, he didn't look great. He wasn't particularly good in the red zone. He wasn't particularly efficient with his rushing. He was okay at receiving. Jamal Williams is arguably the better back, even at this point in time. Significantly better in the red zone. They'll use him a lot on early downs, and that's why his yards per attempt is so low. It's not because he's bad. It's simply because they're using him in really difficult situations. Also, he has one of the best player profiles ever every single year. This guy is a hoot. So I love having him on my fantasy team just because I love having Jamal Williams in my life in some small way. Now, what's the snaps going to look like? Well, we don't know. It depends on whether Kamara even turns up week 1. I think he probably does. And assuming he does, I feel like he's out there at least half the time. They're still using a little bit of Williams, and I believe that they'll bring in Miller a little bit. How much they use Miller and Williams will be the really interesting thing, because it will give us a sign of what's going to happen for years to come, whether they do think of Miller as someone who can take over or whether they think of him more as a sunk cost. The wide receiver room is also really interesting. It's clearly Chris Olave is their main guy. He's a really talented player that doesn't get used a lot. I'm hoping they can get him the ball a lot more this season because he can look really explosive when given the opportunities. They just haven't been able to make it work. I think that this year we probably see him featured slightly more in that Kubiak offense. We've seen him do that at times in the past. So I've got him as my wide receiver 12. That feels really high, but I don't love any of the players after him either. And he's still a young, talented player. He just hasn't quite put it together to the extent that we hoped he would. I think that long-term he's going to be a good player to own in Dynasty, but I'll have him ranked a whole lot lower in redraft. He's more of a long-term option. If you're someone who's looking to win now, you can probably look elsewhere at players like your Amari Coopers and your Devontae Adams, who are going to help you straight away and be that number one who's also excellent for fantasy. I feel like Olave is just a step below those guys, so you can probably get one of those older guys plus some other talented players as well for Olave if you're in a win-now situation. Now, if you're thinking for the future, you can probably buy Olave pretty cheap, or alternatively, wait a couple of weeks into the season and see if the passing game struggles. And if it does, strike then and try to get him because his talent isn't going anywhere and he is a very good player. Rashid Shaheed is an undrafted guy who's suddenly come around and taken on a role in this offense. I don't think him as anything more than a bit of a bit part player. He is talented. He's very good in best ball, but I wouldn't particularly want him in Dynasty or redraft. I'm also not exactly clear on what his snap count's going to look like. They brought in Cedric Wilson. I know that doesn't sound like much, but he does tend to seem to find a way onto the field. He's actually a kind of effective player. So it's hard to know what they do with those last three guys, Cedric Wilson, A.T. Perry, and Bub Means. They're all mediocre players, late round picks in the case of Perry and Means. I think it's probably Wilson who's at least the wide receiver 3, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if they're moving Olave into the slot, if they take off Shaheed and bring in a Wilson or a Perry, especially on those early downs. So they might hurt Shaheed a little bit. I feel like this whole passing game is going to run through Olave, and there'd be a bit of a mess beside him. Perry is someone that you can get very cheap in Dynasty, but unless you're in a really deep league, I wouldn't be particularly interested. Cedric Wilson's too old to be particularly interested in. He's not going to develop into anything. Bub Means, I think, is my 20th ranked rookie wide receiver. He's not particularly exciting either. I can't imagine in most leagues these guys being on rosters. The tight end room is also very interesting because there has been news that Juwan Johnson is injured again. He was obviously injured toward the end of last season. It looks like that may kind of filter towards this season, and he may not be ready for week 1. He wasn't particularly effective last season after a shock-type top 10 season last season. I think we kind of all saw that coming. I certainly had him ranked very low, and I know a lot of others did as well. Taysom Hill just seems to find a way to step up, whether he's being used as a runner or a quarterback or a tight end or a wide receiver, and they find a way to get him on the field and use him effectively. And it seems to be a different way each year. This year, apparently, they're using him as a running back a lot more. But I do think if Johnson misses out on games, it is probably Taysom that's getting a lot of touches. I've got him ranked pretty low in Dynasty. That's because he's 33 years old. That's old for all of those positions except quarterback. And quarterback's the one position where they're not really using him. He's taking direct snaps there, but then he's just running out of that position anyway. So I do think that he's probably going to take plenty of handoffs, get plenty of direct snaps. But I also think initially early in the season, he'll line up in tight end. You'll want him if you're in a win now situation. You're a bit weak in your tight end room. Plus, in best ball, he's obviously a real asset and someone that you definitely want, especially if you're doing best ball Dynasty, which is becoming a lot more popular. If Johnson is out, I do think they also use a lot of Foster Moreau. They used a surprising amount of Moreau last year as well. He's out there in like 30 to 50% of snaps, even when Johnson was healthy. And I feel like that probably continues. He is a good, solid tight end. And I suspect he probably remains that way. The problem is that there's no real injury situations where you can say, oh, yeah, he's clearly going into a good role where I want him. You probably don't want any of these guys except maybe Taysom in certain situations. So I'm not excited about Moreau, but he is at least going to be involved in this offense. Now, the one team in this division that I am really excited about, and I always am excited about this team because they've got such explosive playmakers, it's the Tampa Bay Buccaneers.
Third and long. Mayfield off his back foot. Wants Mike Evans. Got Mike Evans.
Mayfield with time over the middle. Caught. Touchdown. Trey Palmer.
Mayfield looked right. Baker Mayfield down the middle. Godwin has it across midfield. Chris Godwin. Mayfield loading up downfield. He connects. Mayfield. Deep. He's got it. Mike Evans.
End zone.
Third down and goal. To the ground, straight ahead. It's White. End zone. Blitz. White out of the backfield. Breaks the tackle. Wide open in the flat is Irvin. He's getting the block down the sideline. He gets to the 20. He's hunting the pile.
And go after records and run the ball down Liberty's throat.
There they go again. Irving into the secondary. Into the red zone. Turns the corner. With a blocker out in front. Down over the middle is complete to Jalen McMillan. He slipped the tackle.
All of a sudden, it's 3rd and 9. Baker's going to try and run for it.
And Baker Mayfield crosses midfield. Turning inside the 30.
After failing to make the playoffs throughout the 2010s, the Bucs randomly popped up, won a Super Bowl, and then made the playoffs every year since. You would expect they're probably going to again because they're the team that's best set up for success. They're not paying a lot of money to their quarterback. Baker Mayfield is still on a cheap contract, at least for this year, and that means they're able to effectively pay money to a whole lot of veterans who are able to help them on defense and help them be a top 10 defense again this year. They're also paying money to guys like Chris Godwin and Mike Evans, and they managed to find a way to keep performing, even though, especially in the case of Evans, he's aging a little bit. You can see what they've done this year with their additions. They've helped out the running back room. They've got some more depth wide receivers, but they haven't lost anybody. None of those guys are really an issue. Russell Gage is the only guy that's even really a name there, and he didn't play much at all last season either. Most of their players under contracts are defenders, and of course, Baker Mayfield is going to hang around for now a while as well. Despite the fact they've got some very experienced and good key position players, they're actually one of the younger rosters in the league, and I feel like they are building towards being good in the long term. They're really effective in using their cap space. They've also got a lot of dead cap, but that's because they're using it that way intentionally, and they're not having to spend money up elsewhere as well. So let's have a look at what we expect from their offense, because they do have a new offensive coordinator in Liam Cohen, who comes across, I guess, temporarily from the Rams in 2022. He was also there a little bit earlier. So we are expecting a bit of a McVay scheme, but he also OC'd for the Kentucky Wildcats in the NCAA in both 23 and also a little bit before that as well. So it's kind of hard to predict exactly what he's going to do. Is it going to be more of a Rams offense? We can't really use his college play calling because college play calling is very different from NFL play calling. It tends to be a whole lot more run heavy. So I think we probably know that we're going to expect a lot more play action and a whole lot more pre-snap motion, but that doesn't tell us what's going to happen for fantasy. He does like to involve the running back in the passing game, and that stands out, especially in college, because that's not really a college thing to do. And I think that's once again going to help Rachaad White. And I think it's probably also why they brought in Bucky Irving, who is a good receiving running back as well. He tends to run not many plays per game, and that hurts a little bit, although that was also true of the Bucs last season. They still managed to make it work. He also struggles with longer drives and tends to go for bigger plays because as his drives go on, he kind of loses his way a little bit and doesn't seem to have a clear plan on what he's trying to do. So it'll be interesting to see if he can kind of work that out. But I think this team's going to be a real question mark going into the season. One thing we do know is that they've got a lot of talented key position players, and that made Baker Mayfield really effective last year as a top 10 quarterback, and that kind of came out of nowhere. We knew he had good offensive players around him. He wasn't even particularly good. He was just an average quarterback. He was really good in that kind of mid-range areas, getting the ball to guys like Evans and also Chris Godwin, who seemed to struggle to get open, but he still managed to look pretty good when he got the ball in his hands. I expect we see another solid season out of Mayfield, but I don't think it's going to be quite as good as last year. They don't have any clear backup, so it is clearly Mayfield's job, but he doesn't particularly excite me in Dynasty because I just don't believe that he has a reliable path to consistent fantasy output for the long term. And I don't think this offense really has top 5 Baker Mayfield upside. Obviously, he was top 10 last year because he managed to be healthy, but I feel like in a year or two, this is going to be an offense that struggles. Mayfield will still hang around, but without Evans and Godwin, it feels like a rebuild's coming soon. So I don't particularly want Mayfield in Dynasty. I'll probably have him a little bit higher in redraft. The running back room is where I am interested. Rashad White looked good last year, and that surprised me a lot because he wasn't used as an every down back in college. He wasn't used as an every down back in his first season. And then all of a sudden, they're using him a lot. They're putting him out there on 70 to 80% of snaps. I feel like that probably continues to happen. Bucky Irving comes in. He was someone I was pretty excited about coming out. But it does, the more I look at it, seem like this is going to be Rashad White's backfield. Irving's the backup. He probably gets involved in a couple of passing downs. But if you look at Chase Edmonds' injury history, it's not particularly good. So I think they're probably thinking, well, we need a better, clear backup and maybe someone that we can kind of groom to take over for White in a couple of years instead of giving him that big contract. So I think it's mainly White's room. Irving is the handcuff, and I think he's probably going to be a solid handcuff. How much Edmonds and Sean Tucker are involved, I'm not sure. Probably not so much Tucker, but I do think that Edmonds will probably at least get a few snaps. The wide receiver room is very strong. Mike Evans has been outstanding for a long time. He's the wide receiver one pretty much every single year. Ended up with one of his best fantasy seasons of recent times last year. He just seems to keep going. He's one of those players where you've got to stop going, oh, he's going to fall, he's going to regress, he's going to fall back, he's getting older. He will at some stage, but instead just take the value where it is. You can get him real cheap because everyone knows that he's in his 30s. Everyone knows that breakdown is going to happen at some point in time. But he could still be very good this year. And if he is, he's going to be an absolute bargain. So in Dynasty, he's still someone that mildly interests me. But in redraft, I'll have him really high. He'll be a top 15 back for me a wide receiver for me in redraft. Chris Godwin was a little bit disappointing last year. We're talking about a guy who had a top 2 fantasy finish in 2019, despite missing a couple of games. He has been really good, but last year, when you watched him play, he didn't seem explosive at all. He seemed to really struggle to get out of his breaks. He didn't seem to be getting separation. He seemed to be playing really well with his brain, but his body just didn't seem as explosive as we've seen. That really concerns me. He's actually nowhere near as old as Evans, but he seems to me like he's fading a little bit. He's also mainly a slot guy, but they've just brought in a slot guy, and they'll also use Trey Palmer there. So they're kind of pushing him out wide a little bit more. I'm not really sure what it's going to look like for him this year. It's a little bit of a concern for me, but they are still paying him a big contract. So he's clearly still going to be one of their top 2 wide receivers. It's just I'm not sure that the production is a little bit capped for him. And I feel like in Dynasty, he loses value because I can't really see how long he's going to play for, and I am concerned he's going to fall away within the next year or two. I know that Jalen McMillan comes in, but I actually think that probably to start the year, Trey Palmer is probably their wide receiver 3. McMillan is very much a slot guy, and you don't really need him on the field immediately because you can have Chris Godwin play there if you need to. So I feel like McMillan gets some snaps initially, but I feel like Palmer's probably the favorite to be the wide receiver 3 initially, and then McMillan slowly takes over as the year goes on. They've also lost Devin Tompkins, so I feel like they've brought in Sterling Shepard to replace that depth option, plus Raheem Jarrett's there as well. Also wouldn't surprise me if McMillan is used a lot on special teams too. So I'm not particularly interested in any of these wide receiver 3 guys. Evans and Godwin are the main guys for me, but McMillan does have some upside as a guy who could be a solid slot receiver. We've seen a lot of good college slot receivers, guys like Justin Jefferson, who we thought of as slot-only guys who've come in and turned out to be excellent wide receivers. So McMillan at least has some upside. That's why for me, I think he's my wide receiver 16 for rookies. And I feel like that's justified by the upside there. Now, the tight end room was really interesting. Cade Otton was someone who was okay in his first season. He's playing nearly 100% of snaps. There were games where he wasn't taken off the field offensively. That's crazy for a tight end. It's also shocking how little production he had given that. They need to find better ways of using him if they're going to have him on the field. He's a pretty talented receiving back, and he's a solid blocker as well. They also use plenty of Coke Heath, but he's mainly as a like an H-back, fullback kind of situation. Payne Durham is the backup. He's not particularly exciting. They brought in Devin Culp. He's definitely not exciting. He's a special teams guy. It is Cade Otton. It's going to be Cade Otton and a lot of Cade Otton. He just doesn't seem to be able to get enough of the ball because it's all going to White, Evans, and Godwin. If the offensive coordinator change causes them to use a little bit more of Odin, that could be really good for him because we know that Baker Mayfield is willing to use his tight end. We just need to actually see it happen. So Odin is someone that I've moved up slightly and moved him past Sanders. And I would not think you're crazy for wanting to stash him on your bench as an upside play because I do think the upside is clearly there. So that's the NFC South. We have one more division left. We'll be talking about the NFC West, and then I'm moving on to talk about OTAs and a whole lot more fantasy football stuff. I'm doing a lot of analysis stuff, looking at some numbers over the last few years to work out what we can expect from rookies in their first season specifically. So look out for that video in the next couple of weeks probably not even the next couple of weeks, probably within this week as well. As always, make sure you like and subscribe. On Instagram, find us at the Fantasy First Down, and on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. If you have fantasy questions, I'm happy to answer them there or also in the comments below too. You can also check out our website, ffdfantasyfootball.com, where you can find my dynasty and rookie rankings as well. I hope you have an excellent rest of the day, and I look forward to seeing you guys on the next video in a couple of days' time.